Welcome everyone, I'm Mr. B here for another virtual field trip. Here we are at the Carnegie Science Center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's the building there, but the real field trip is here on the other side for the USS Requin. SS-4A1, meaning it's the 481st submarine commissioned by the U.S. Navy, commissioned 1945. The Requin was built as a World War II submarine. It was built in Kittery, Maine, and floated out to sea to go fight the Germans, but this was late 1945. April of 1945, so the war ends there. They move it through the Panama Canal and refit it to go fight the Japanese in the Pacific. Had we invaded the Japanese home islands, the Requin would have been a frontline sub controlling Japanese ports and sinking plenty of merchant vessels, trying to end the war as quickly as possible, protecting our invasion force. However, we didn't invade the home islands. The atomic bomb made that not necessary. So the USS Requin was one of 26 Tench Class submarines that had no real job to do. And so the Requin, like the rest of those Tench boats, were refitted and used in the Cold War. The Requin would be used for 23 more years, decommissioned all the way in 1968, used in various purposes during the Cold War, including as our Navy's first radar picket ship, and I'll get into what that means later on. Now there are just two Tench Class boats left in existence, here the USS Requin in Pittsburgh and the USS Torsk in Baltimore. So if you get a chance, I hope you'll go take a look and see what another Tench Class submarine looks like, the only two left in existence. The Requin worked a lot of things as a radar picket ship, a lot of research, going out to sea and doing the things, performing in war games to help train our naval sailors, our combat sailors, in how to hunt a submarine, and the Requin was quite good at it. After it was retired in 1968, it became a training vessel until 1972, kept in dry dock, and then it became a tourist vessel in Tampa, Florida. It would be finally, it would lose its footing in Tampa, and it would be brought here to Pittsburgh in 1990, where it's sat here ever since. So we'll go ahead and take you on into the forward torpedo room, and we'll take you through the entire USS Requin. Welcome aboard the USS Requin. This sub is nearly 75 years old, built in 1945. It served for 23 years, retired in 1968. And so what you see is the real thing. The stuff we've added at the Science Center is pretty obvious. On board, the crew would have been 81, plus the captain. Biggest crew was 110, and they'd be on here for about 3 months at a time. You're here in the forward torpedo room because that's forward, and this is a torpedo. We fire these torpedoes out of these 6 torpedo tubes to attack enemy ships. On board, we would have carried up to 18 of these torpedoes all in this room. 1 in each of those 6 tubes, they'd be left fully loaded. 4 below deck, 4 on this bottom rail, and then 4 on the top rail, leaving only this black path in the middle in which to walk. Above those torpedoes are a number of beds. That's right, we had up to 10 beds in here, which means up to 30 people called this their bedroom. And believe it or not, they fought to be in here. They wanted to be in the bunks above the bombs, because not only is this the roomiest for the enlisted men, just wait, you'll see, those bunks are pretty cramped. But it's also the quietest and the coolest up here. It'd only be about 80 degrees in this room versus 130 back by the diesels. When those are fully running, it'd be 130 degrees in the engine room. So let's take a quick look closer at these torpedo tubes. So, torpedo tubes work using compressed air. They use compressed air to force these torpedoes out of the submarine. These are 23 inches across, and those torpedo tubes are 23 1/8 inches across. So not much room for error. These torpedoes weigh 3,000 pounds, 750 pounds of which was an explosive of Torpex. Now, these torpedoes are loaded by hand using what's called block and tackle. You attach a pulley here to these loops, you attach the other end to a block on the far end of the torpedo, and you simply slide them forward in using 3 or 4 guys. They can do it in about reload a torpedo in about 15 minutes. Not easy, certainly. Once that's in, you have all of the instruments to control the torpedo torpedo data computers and such to set up a gyroscope. These torpedoes are not guiding, they don't home in any way, but they do have gyroscopes to guide their thing. So using that thing directly in front underneath that big piston which runs our dive planes, you can set these torpedoes to make a full 90-degree turn once it leaves the torpedo tube. So using trigonometry, using a lot of advanced math, calculating the speed of your enemy, how far away you are, and such things like that, including the rotation of the Earth, you can make these torpedoes aim and hit exactly where you're trying to get to. You don't have to move the whole sub to do it. These torpedoes, like all torpedoes, don't explode on impact. That's one of those big Hollywood myths. Torpedoes typically explode beneath a ship because water doesn't expand, so that when you explode, you basically create a hole in the water. The initial explosion will lift the ship up, stressing the keel, and then basically the ship falls into the hole in the water, snapping it in half. 2 of these torpedoes, these Mark 23s, will take down an aircraft carrier. 1 will do just about anything less. So they are potent, to say the least. The Requin carried 24 of them at max capacity. So, putting things back together. Let's carry on deeper into forward torpedo. Now, directly above you is what's called the escape trunk. This is one of 2 ways off of the submarine if it were to get stranded on the bottom. It basically works like an airlock. The manual says 3, but every submariner I've talked to, it says 7 to 10 men can fit up in there. Close the bottom hatch, flood it, pressurize it, and then you swim out of that hatch on the side. Now, doing that will let you get to the surface from about 100 feet down. Absolute max at 300. Because with the differences in pressure and the amount of nitrogen bubbles that have been forced into your bloodstream from that increased air pressure will cause the bends. You really can't do much beyond that. Even if you make it to the surface, you probably won't survive it. That also said, you have to exhale the entire time you're going to the surface, because the air in your lungs is compressed air from the depth. And as you go further up, that air expands. So unless you're breathing out the entire way up, you can pop your lungs. It's not pretty. It's counterintuitive. It takes a lot of training, and that's actually one of the final tests that they have to do in submariner school, is making a 100-foot ascent in a giant water tower up in Connecticut. Now, as we go through here, I'm going to pop you briefly in one of the more popular things, and that is our shower. Sailors would usually get a 30-second shower every 2 weeks at best. Many were much closer to a month at a time. I met one submariner who was on this boat who said that he actually never showered on board. Despite 5 years of service here, he never got to shower on board the Requin. Water is a precious commodity at sea. It's a really, really precious commodity. You have salt water all around you, but fresh is much more difficult to come by. You have to boil off that salt water to do it. So basically you get a very quick shower only when you absolutely need it. So you can imagine that the smell was fantastic. Up next, we're going to go to officers' country. So, officers' country is the luxurious part of the boat. We'll start off here with the yeoman's office. Someone has to do the payroll and take care of paperwork, and this is the office in which that happens. You'll get some different configurations on different boats, but Requin has theirs as far forward as you can. On the other side, we have the officer's pantry. Now, this would be where things would be plated, food plated for the officers, where they could eat in the officer's mess. The officer's mess has all the things necessary to get in contact with who needs to run things, but this is where the officers are able to have their meals, which they eat the same food as the rest of the sailors, and this is where most of the action happens, the dialogue in those submarine movies. Now, we saw the bunks in forward torpedo. These are the bunks for the officers. These are probably as nice as they get, but even then, that middle bunk is pretty tiny. I've been told that you have to get out, roll over, and then get back in if you want to change your position in one of these bunks. We can see what that would look more like. You have a sink, a basic basin to wash in. You have some room for officers to do the things that they absolutely need to do. And you have some of the storage for the comforts of home, but it is by no means pretty. Here we have for the officers, the petty officers who work their way up. They get it less nice. And then we have our captain's quarters. This is the only place for privacy on the entire boat, and even then, captain always has the stuff necessary to run the boat from his cabin. Our first captain was Slade DeVille Cutter, a Medal of Honor recipient, and a man who was 6'4", 220, and played football at the Naval Academy. So a big dude who was able to run through these hatches. The bulkhead doors are 38 inches high by 18 inches across. They are by no means big. Many people complain about them, but all things considered, I think they do pretty well. Here we are in the control room. This is where all the fun really happens. On that side is the electrical that runs the boat. Here we have the secondary helm. This is one of the steering wheels. There are two on board. The other is up in the conning tower above us. With that mentioned, the conning tower is where the submarine is actually run from. That's where the captain spends most of his time. And periscopes don't come down into the control room like they do in the movies. They do that so it's more convenient to see everything. The periscopes are 60 feet tall, and so you need that to go all the way to the bottom to be able to be held in. So you have to be pretty high up to actually get to what you need. Periscope depth is 60 feet down, and you can launch your torpedoes from there and send messages. There are antennas attached to the periscopes, etc. But the captain spends most of his time upstairs in a very tiny room, really enough room for him and one navigation officer in order to drive the boat. That's the other thing. People look at this for the steering wheel, the helm, and they ask, well, where's the windshield? Where are the windows? Well, windows would be one of the first things that would go on a submarine if you were to be depth charged. If you were to be attacked, the windows would break first. So you have to use math and maps in order to work your way through. Based on dead reckoning, you can tell, knowing how fast you've gone, knowing how long you've been going that way, and knowing the direction you're going, you can figure out where you are on the Earth. And that's what this plotting table is, and this gyroscopic compass. This compass has a 750-pound ball of mercury in it to keep a metal disc spinning, so it's unaffected by the rest of the metal of the submarine around it. It is a gyroscope, and you actually have to compensate for the curve of the Earth as you travel over it, because gyroscopes will point at a fixed point in space. Gyroscopes are fun. This is a Loran system. This is all part of doing that as well. If you can get any 3 radio stations, you can identify where you are using trigonometry. Radio stations typically do not move. So if you know where they are and you know you have a signal and you can pinpoint which direction that signal is coming from, you can, using 3 of them, calculate exactly where you are. Not bad. You always wonder, who's going to use this math? Well, on submarines, they use that math. This is a small arms locker. Had a number of M1 Garands, a gun to shoot lines, pistols, and my favorite line in the entire manual, grenades as necessary. So we also have the wheels for our dive planes. Dive planes function just like wings on a plane, but underwater. You tilt them down, you go down. You tilt them up, you come up. 4 turns of the wheel would be 1 degree with the hydraulics on, but hydraulics are noisy. So you don't want to use hydraulics whenever you're running underwater in silent mode. So without the hydraulics, it's 20 turns for 1 degree. Now the people manning the dive planes would usually be your most junior men on board, and it would not be uncommon for a captain to go, all right, let's go 5 degrees down, 5 degrees up, 5 degrees down again, and level off. Just give those guys a real workout. You might have noticed the Odin fish hanging here. It's a little fish with Odin carved into it. The men on board here in the 1960s got really into a movie about the Vikings, to the point where they were caught above deck putting Viking horns on their hats, and the captain kind of put the kibosh on that right after that. We also have over here what's called the Christmas tree and the valves to go ahead and dive. So over here, the Christmas tree is a list of all of the openings on the boat, and it used to be red and green. Red meaning that it's open, green means you're good, it's closed. But that was changed to amber, so it all works better in the red light. Red light is used at night, so you don't lose your night vision if you had to go above deck. So this is a list of all our hull openings, and these valves let out all of the air from our ballast tanks to take on water and make us heavy enough to sink, to dive beneath the waves. Over here we have the high pressure manifolds to blow compressed air into those ballast tanks, force all that water out, and make the submarine buoyant enough to float again. So all of the actions of a submarine happen right here. This is the dive alarm, and this is how it all happens. From right here, they would call out dive, dive, blow off the dive alarm twice, and down you go. You would be able, the goal was to be able to get to 60 feet in 60 seconds. That's periscope depth. Quickly enough that an airplane that was coming at you would not be able to poke holes in you using their machine guns. The max depth of the Requin was 412 feet. That's test depth. It did once hit 500 feet during an accident. We had a valve that was isolated, and so they didn't know what the actual depth was. The captain luckily woke up saying something's not right and figured it out. Crush depth is somewhere around 800 feet. Let's go further on. We have here the radio room. It does still work. And we have a Navy vet who comes in and he works on the ham radio, and various holidays he'll contact other boats and talk to ham radio operators. And he's always said that, you know, oh yeah, I'm contacting you from a submarine. They're all like, yeah, right, sure you are. Here we go to the mess deck. Here is your kitchen where you serve 4 meals a day for those 82 people on board. Everyone eats the same chow, which is why submariners have the best food in the Navy. The steak and eggs there is certainly accurate. There was one story of a boat that got so sick of having steak every day that they met up with another submarine to trade off for some lobster. We have a trash compactor idea here. Basically, you can drop trash out the side of the sub and onto the bottom of the ocean using what's right here. The men spend most of their time here on the mess deck. Areas to play games, areas to congregate. This is where most of life happens. You serve 3 shifts, 8 hours on, 8 hours off, and 8 hours for training. You get your sleep in usually one of those. Depending on how things are going, you spend a lot of time in here learning the boat, talking to everyone, playing a lot of cards, and using an ice cream machine, which unfortunately the Requin still doesn't have its. Those are very hard to find. Well, I said the bunks in forward torpedo were the comfortable ones. This is the rest of the bunk room, what's called berthing. And in berthing, B-E-R-T-H, is where you have all your bunks. And there would have been ones where you are right now. We've taken some out so that you can get around here better and see things a little better. You would be hot racking for all of these, meaning when you get your 8 hours of sleep, and when you get out, someone else comes in and gets their 8 hours of sleep, and when they get out, someone else comes in and gets their 8 hours of sleep before you return to your bed. The bunks never really get a chance to cool off. On the Requin, we never had any kind of assigned bunks here. It was simply first come, first serve, but some would have it. It all depends on your captain and how the culture of the boat is. Over here you can see some of the more interesting things that have been found on board or donated to us by Requin veterans, including all 3 of our patches. The first, the World War II patch, our patch as a radar picket submarine, and the final patch for the Requin in its final years of training and research. Including the escape trunks, there are 4 total hatches on board. Hatches go up and out. Doors, the bulkhead doors are the ones we've been going through. In here we have the rest of the showers. Now that first shower would typically be left open. That was used by the cooks and the officers, and they would shower a bit more often than everyone else. These showers would typically be filled with potatoes because they were more useful as storage there than for a shower, considering how rarely they were actually used. Hygiene on board was basic, though any regulations concerning shaving were relaxed because it was better to save water than to have fresh, clean shaven faces. On the other side here, we have the head. Now, a head is a bathroom on any kind of boat, so if you hear that in the Navy, the head is the bathroom. Why they have their individual language, well, that's a much longer story. There are 4 of these toilets on board, 4 heads, for 82 people. You thought your morning routine was tough? Imagine this. And sometimes that language becomes a problem. I always like the story that Bob Hope, when he first sang at Annapolis for the sailors going off to World War II, they sang the song "You Go to My Head," a love song. It's cheesy, but but they got uproarious laughter the entire time, and they didn't figure out until afterwards what head means in the Navy. Here we are in the forward engine room. We have 4 what are essentially diesel locomotive engines. Each one has 10 pistons that run opposed. We'll see that better in the next room. They run 1,600 horsepower, 720 RPM. They are intense. Now, the thing is that they are really just building electricity up. They don't actually run any engine directly because drivetrains are one of the first things that are knocked out of commission if you are to be depth charged. So the U.S. Navy switched very quickly to an all-battery setup. There are batteries beneath officers' country and the berthing area. There were 420 tons of batteries on board, each one a lead-acid battery that stands about 5 feet tall, and each one of those is quite lethal. In fact, if you get any salt water in there, it mixes to create chlorine gas, and that'll kill you pretty quickly. So these are building up electricity to charge the batteries and to run the electric motors that actually move the submarine. They are big, they are noisy, and like I said, it would hit 130 degrees Fahrenheit in here when those engines were running. So imagine a 4-hour shift in that. The thing right behind me is a water distiller. Allegedly, it would do 1,000 gallons a day. It never came anywhere close. That's why fresh water is such a precious commodity. You would have someone running shifts on this just to make sure that there's enough drinking water, enough cooling water for those batteries. Again, can't have salt in there because of the chlorine gas, and enough for the basic maintenance of the boat. The USS Requin had a snorkel added to it. That's what a lot of this is going on. The snorkel allows those diesels to run underwater. It works just like a snorkel for, in a pool. That works, but it's not great. You have rubber flaps to keep it so water doesn't get into those diesels if you have waves coming over, and so it creates a lot of suction in here, and it's just not very pleasant. But it does allow you to run, I believe the longest under for a snorkel is 63 days. The longest record for U.S. submarines, I believe it is the world record, is 107 days underwater, I do believe. I'll have to double check that. Here we have in the aft engine room, I talked about the snorkel. I didn't really talk about how long a submarine like this can stay underwater. I said initially that these guys would be out here for 75 to 90 days on a tour. Most of that time would be spent on the surface of the water. That's because boats like this had no way to make oxygen from seawater, like modern boats do. That takes a lot of electricity. When you have a nuclear reactor, you have that much electricity. But otherwise, you really don't. So that electrolysis to split hydrogen and oxygen, you dump the hydrogen, breathe the oxygen, that didn't exist here yet. So once you button up the hatches, all the air inside is all you've got. And you have to make that last. If that will last you somewhere between 24 and 36 hours. You can last longer, but you have to start getting into things of planning. Anyone who is not essential personnel is confined to their beds so they don't breathe too much. Smoking is stopped immediately. Yes, they used to smoke on these boats. In fact, one of our sub-vets said that he tried to cut down to 1 cigarette every 15 minutes. That lasted 3 cigarettes. So you can imagine just how much smoke was inside this entire thing. You spend most of your time on the surface, and then you're able to get beneath the waves. That's why the submarine is shaped the way it is, because it runs more on the surface. The modern submarines are much more at home, underwater. They perform better underwater, and so they stay under for weeks and months at a time. You might also notice the laundry. There were no laundry services on board the Requin. Some boats would have a washing machine, but they are exceptionally rare, and I've never actually heard any statistics on how much they were actually used. You would hang up your clothes in the engine rooms because it was hot enough that they would dry if you happened to get soaked for any number of reasons, usually going above deck and taking care of something. So you came on with 3 changes of clothes, and a lot of stories of wives and girlfriends would come back and simply throw the stuff out and start over. It wasn't worth the time. They were too far gone wearing the same 3 sets of clothes for 3 months out at sea. So yeah, you would have people drying their clothes, but there was no laundry service on board submarines. So there might be another jump cut in there. So as I was saying, with opposed pistons engine, those people who might be a bit more gearheads might notice that this engine looks like it's upside down. And yes and no. There are 10 cylinders in here, and in each of those cylinders are 2 pistons, one in each direction. So every time you get an explosion of diesel fuel, it uses the same fuel that a school bus uses, though we carried 115,000 gallons on board, enough to go from San Francisco to Tokyo and back. With every squeeze of those pistons, the diesel fuel ignites and forces out in both directions. So you really get the most out of every single explosion. It's the best way to drive as much electricity as possible. More of the snorkel gear. Now finally we get into maneuvering. This is where all of the electricity was moved around to make a submarine like this go. These stations move electricity where it needs to go to move things from the batteries to the motors, from the engines to the batteries, the engines to the motors, etc. Moving that around. So it would be quite hot in here. It is the best insulated you get. And I don't know if you can read these dials, but over 400 volts, this stuff will kill you many, many, many times over. So it is dangerous work. Beneath us are directly the motors themselves, and this DC voltage is dangerous. Dangerous job. A lot of lead acid involved with those batteries. Guys would wear dungarees, jeans, and you knew who worked in the engine rooms and the batteries based on how many holes in their dungarees they had. Last room of the boat is the stern room, and this one should look rather different than the rest. It's much more open. You have a much more open environment because this was once built. Well, first off, when it was first built, it was an aft torpedo room. So there were 4 torpedo tubes back here, 10 torpedoes. Looked a lot like that first room. And if you go on submarine go around, that's typically what you'll see in the last room. This one had its torpedo room removed in 1946 in favor of radar equipment. Lots and lots of classified radar equipment was in here for its job as a radar picket ship. A radar picket ship, the idea was that you had to have a boat way out in front of the fleet in order to look for incoming kamikaze planes and later missiles. It took a lot longer to shoot those things down based on the speed involved. So the Requin, a fast boat, could get out in front and radio back whatever it sees on the radar. Send that back, give the information to the fleet, and then get underwater so it wasn't at risk and it could pop back up whenever it was safe. The USS Requin was the first radar picket ship of the U.S. Navy, and so it led the way on testing this kind of technology. Later on, that would be done by planes and helicopters, and now satellites perform that duty for the Navy. This was also used as air control for Regulus missiles, a type of early cruise missile, nuclear arm that would be fly for a long distance, and they would launch them from submarines off the coast, and you'd have to have other submarines, once they got out of range of the launch boat, to pick up guidance and keep it going. So Requin was part of our nuclear threat deterrence, even though it was a diesel-electric boat, had no nuclear power, never carried nuclear weapons. It could help get those nuclear weapons to their targets. Afterwards, late in the boat's life, this became a bunk room because more beds are always a good thing. So with that, we'll go up on deck. We'll take one last look around, and that's going to finish things for our virtual field trip. Here we are out on the deck of the USS Requin. You can see beautiful Pittsburgh right in front of us. We are here on the Ohio River to wrap up this virtual field trip. So out on deck is where you would spend some of your time, because again, this submarine was not able to spend all of its time underwater like a modern nuclear boat. These were ships that could go underwater more than full-on submarines in the modern sense. That right down those steps is forward torpedo at the beginning of our tour. Now this behind me is called the sail. And the Requin has a rather large sail, basically to get radar equipment up higher to do a better job as a radar picket submarine. The conning tower that we talked about, that small room for the captain and the periscopes, is inside of this, and hopefully I guess you'll get a better look from the very beginning of this video of those periscopes sticking up out of the top of it. This deck was actually here, just like this. Most people ask because they tend to see those more cigar-shaped submarines. They're not used to seeing a deck. They think maybe, oh, this was done for the tourists now. No, these decks were absolutely here, and believe it or not, it's made of a wood so dense that if it were to break off from an attack or something, it would sink and not float up and give away your position. Rather handy that way. Very dense. You actually can't hammer a nail through it. You have to drill holes and then put in screws. It gets to be pretty impressive. So these boats would be out for 3 months at a time, 82 people contained on one thing, open ocean, leading the way, protecting our coastlines, and the Requin itself doing a lot of work as a spy submarine, listening to things going on in the Soviet Union, and acting as our first line of defense as a radar picket sub. So I think I've covered everything I'm going to be able to cover. That's a tour of the USS Requin here at the Carnegie Science Center in Pittsburgh, PA. I'm Mr. B. Thanks for coming along.